Hi guys, I am Serena Prina. I was a teacher at the Liceo Musicale for many years. I was also the teacher of some of the students that are now listening to this lesson, and I decided to contribute to this difficult moment of our country, of our lives, with some lessons about Shakespeare and music, and especially Shakespeare and Giuseppe Verdi. Because, as you probably know, Verdi composed three operas inspired by Shakespeare: Macbeth, that in history of music is Macbeth, Otello, and Falstaff, that in history of music is Falstaff. Falstaff is not a work by Shakespeare. Falstaff is a character that Shakespeare used in two works, Henry IV and in The Merry Wives of Windsor, Le Allegre Comari di Windsor. So we shall focus our attention on the two great tragedies by Shakespeare that were used by Verdi. They were used nearly at the beginning of his career because Macbeth was written in 1847. Verdi had already written nine operas, but anyhow, it was at the early period of Verdi. And while Otello and Falstaff belonged to the last one, Falstaff was Verdi's last opera, and Otello was written in 1887, that is 40 years after Macbeth. So, in a way, we can say that at the beginning, if not really the very beginning, but anyhow, the early period of Verdi, Verdi turned to Shakespeare, and then he turned to Shakespeare at the end. We shall start talking about Macbeth because, well, it was his first, Verdi's first interest. We have to say that neither Verdi nor his librettists, that were Piave for Francesco Maria Piave for um, Macbeth and Boito for Otello and Falstaff, they didn't know English. Neither of them knew English. They probably read Shakespeare's tragedy in French or also in Italian because at the beginning of the 19th century, around 1830, 1835, there had been several translations of Shakespeare's works, especially Hamlet, Otello, Macbeth. So either French or Italian were the texts that Verdi and his helpers read. Macbeth is the tragedy of power. Everybody knows that it is a tragedy about what a man is ready to do to get the power, to maintain the power, which sort of crimes he's ready to commit for the power. Of course, Shakespeare's tragedies have several levels, so this is just the surface. You will see how instead we shall find many other themes and levels below the surface, but obviously it's the first one. And in this tragedy, I'm going to tell you the plot because it's important to know the plot. Maybe you know it, but I will sum it up quite quickly. At the beginning of a tragedy, Macbeth is a hero. He's a great soldier. He has just won an important battle for his king, and he's coming back to the military camp. On the way back, he, who is together with his friend and companion Banco, they meet three witches, and the witches make some prophecies. They tell Macbeth that he's going to become Thane of Glamis, then Thane of Cawdor, and then King of Scotland. When Banco asks about his future, what is going to happen to him, the witches say, well, you will not be king, but you will be father of kings. And then the witches disappear. And Macbeth and Banco are upset, are a little bit troubled by this vision when two messengers arrive and they greet Macbeth, calling him Thane of Cawdor, because the king had just given him the title of Thane of Cawdor. And so also the second, because the first prediction, the Thane of Glamis, he had already become Thane of Glamis because the previous Thane had died. So The first prediction had come true, the second had come true. Well, there was a third prediction, which was the most important, becoming King of Scotland. Macbeth immediately writes a letter to his wife, Lady Macbeth. Macbeth is a great character, is probably the most important character of the first half of the tragedy and also of the opera. And when she receives the letter, she immediately understands what has to be done. Moreover, she comes to know that that night King Duncan, the king of Scotland, is going to sleep at Macbeth Castle on his way back home. What an occasion! Lady Macbeth has no doubts, and she convinces Macbeth, who instead tries to resist, she convinces him to kill the king, and the king is killed. Macbeth becomes king. But he is worried because he suspects Banco, especially because Banco knows about the prophecies, about the predictions, about the witches, and also Banco was had been told to be the future father of kings, so he's dangerous. And here Macbeth decides to kill Banco. He hires two killers, and he does this without telling anything to Lady Macbeth. And this is very important. Remember this point, because in Verdi's opera, this point will be a bit different. It is important because it is the independence of Macbeth. He had to be pushed to action in the first part. Now he can act without the help of Lady Macbeth. Banco is killed, but his son, who was together with Banco and had to be killed because he could have been the future king of Scotland, well, the son escapes. During the night, there is a banquet at Macbeth Castle, and Banco's ghost arrives. Only Macbeth can see him, but he loses control. He can't control himself. He's driven crazy. And Lady Macbeth immediately, like a tiger, she jumps up and she defends him and sends the others away, protects her husband. After that, Macbeth is so worried that he wants to meet the witches again and asks them for more predictions. And the witches tell him that he will be safe as long as the Burnham Wood, which was a wood forest near his castle, wouldn't move towards the castle, and then that he need not worry because he wouldn't have been killed by man born of woman, uomo nato da donna viva, non sarebbe stato ucciso da nessun uomo nato da donna viva. So this, after that, Macbeth embarks on a reign of terror. He kills a lot of people to maintain the power. So this is a really dark tragedy. And among these people, he kills the family of Macduff. Macduff was a baron who had escaped at the beginning of the tragedy after the killing of Duncan. And Macduff joins Malcolm. Malcolm was the son of Duncan, the ex-king, the king who had been killed. And Malcolm is convinced by Macduff to march against Macbeth, to fight against Macbeth. And while Macbeth is in his castle, suddenly he sees the forest, Burnham Wood, which moves towards the castle because the soldiers of Malcolm's and Macduff's armies had cut the branches of the trees and were carrying the branches as a sort of camouflage while they were getting close to the castle. Moreover, Macduff, when he was born not in a natural way, but with a parto cesareo, because his mother had died before his birth, so he was not born of woman, non era nato da donna viva. So in the end, we have the catharsis, that is, Macbeth, the bad guy, the bad one, is punished, is killed, and the new king is Malcolm, the son of Duncan, is not the son of Banquo, but the audience of Shakespeare knew exactly, perfectly, that the new king of England, because Macbeth was written in 16 after the death of Elizabeth I. And as you know, Elizabeth I died without children. So after her death, the new king of England was the son of Mary Stuart, James IV of Scotland, who became James I of England. And everybody knew that the legend was that he was a descendant of Banquo. Moreover, in the tragedy, there is a rally, c'è una processione of kings. And the last king, member of this rally, used to carry a mirror when the king was in the theater looking at the performance and stopped in front of the king with the mirror, and so the image of James I was reflected on the stage, just to represent the fact that he was a descendant of Banquo. Shakespeare wrote this tragedy as a sort of homage to the new king in order to obtain his favor and his protection. So there is a historical background. Also, the origin of the tragedy is historical because Shakespeare is said to have taken inspiration from a book which was published in the second half of the 16th century called the Holinshed Chronicles. It was a book about the history of Britain in the Middle Ages. And in this book, there is a King Duncan and a King Macbeth, and a story which is somehow quite similar to the one told by Shakespeare. This story in the chronicle is set before the Norman invasion. You know that the Norman invasion took place in 1066 with the Battle of Hastings, with William the Conqueror. You know, you studied all this stuff. And this is very important. That is, in the chronicle, the book was, the story was before that. Why is it important? Well, you have also studied this year Beowulf and the origins of English literature, and you probably know that the values of that period were mainly the loyalty to the Lord, the loyalty to the clan, and hospitality. These three values, which are still important today, at least some of them, well, were essential, fundamental for the society of the early Middle Ages. And if you consider the actions of Macbeth, you see how he broke all the important rules of his age. That is, he killed his king, so he was not loyal to his lord. He killed his relative because Duncan was his cousin, so he was not loyal to the rule of loyalty to the clan. And then he killed his guest, ha ucciso il suo ospite. It was a terrible crime. Three terrible crimes committed by Macbeth in order to get the power. Let's go back to the beginning of this tragedy. This tragedy opens in a very particular way. Opens with three witches in a desolate land. And these three witches are, they express the word, represent the word of chaos. And they speak in a particular way. I want just to read the first lines just to show you how different from the traditional Shakespearean lines the lines of the witches are. They say, "When shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain, when the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won? That will be ere the set the sun, whether placed upon the heath, where to meet with Macbeth. I come, grey mocking, paddocks call, and on, fair is fall, and fall is fair, over through the fog and filthy air. You immediately understand that the rhythm da 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 na 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 is different from the usual lines you are used to read in Shakespeare. So they really represent a different word, the word of the supernatural, which is not connected with religion or God, but is something strange, something evil, something totally negative, which is characterized by its own rhythm. What I've just read, is the first scene. Then we have a change of scene, and from the desolate land where the witches appear, we arrive in a military camp, the opposite, the reign of order, the military camp, il regno dell'ordine. Well, after that, after 2 or 3 pages, we have a third change of scene, and we are again in the forest. Then we are in the chamber of the throne of the king. Then we are in Lady Macbeth's room. So, in the first act, just only in the first act, we have 7 changes of scene, which is a lot, and which makes Macbeth particularly difficult to be represented on the stage, even today. This is for the tragedy, but also for the opera. It's very difficult to change scene, even with the highest and most advanced technology, to change the scene 7 times. Macbeth was often used in the cinema. You have a lot of films about Macbeth. I do suggest you to watch, if you have time and if you are interested in the cinema, to watch The Throne of Blood, Il Trono di Sangue by Akira Kurosawa, who was one of the greatest film director of the 20th century, a Japanese film director who was very close also to our Western culture, and so he often referred to Shakespeare in his works. But there are a lot, even quite recent, because the cinema can easily change a scene. It's the characteristic of a cinematic technique. But in a theater, it's difficult. You probably know that in the Elizabethan theater, this was instead possible because the audience was used to imagine the situation, the place where the different actions took place. There were no scenery on the stage, so it was very simple. Maybe somebody said, "Oh, we are in a forest," and the audience immediately imagined the forest. We are in the king's room, and a simple chair was the throne. So the audience of the Elizabethan age didn't need a realistic representation of the scene on the stage. And I was thinking, and I want to show you the staging of Verdi's Macbeth, staging La Messa in Scena, which was, according to me, very, very well done, and which really somehow overcame the difficulty of the changes of scene. Some years ago, it was still 1995, I think 1996, they created on the stage of La Scala a huge blue cube. Then I will show you a picture, which was not flat on the stage, but which was on one edge. Now I show you. I have no photographs, but I have this image. I think you can see. You see the cube, and this cube could move slightly right or slightly left, and so each time the scene changed, and the color inside the cube changed. It could be red when the action was particularly violent, or could be green or yellow or blue. So this was a very clever way of representing this absolute characteristic of the tragedy and of the opera, of course. You just, if you want to see more pictures, you just digit Macbeth Verdi blue cube, and you find several images of this very interesting and important staging, which was used for many years because I didn't see it in 1995. I saw it in 2010, so it was used for nearly 20 years, more than 15 years. So it means that it was really successful. Okay, we were talking about the beginning of a tragedy. The witches use some words which are very important. Fair is foul and foul is fair. Il brutto è bello, il bello è brutto. Why are they important? Well, on one hand, they contain the meaning of the tragedy itself, but they also correspond to the first words pronounced by Macbeth when he appears on the stage. I'm going to read you when he arrives on the stage. He says, questa è la prima battuta, the first cue. So foul and fair a day I have not seen. That is, Macbeth uses exactly the same words used by the witches. What does this mean? What does this suggest? Well, on one hand, we might say that the witches are the projections of Macbeth's dreams, hopes, desires, and so he uses the same words because they come from the inside of his mind. But at the same time, we also know that Banco is with him, and also Banco sees the witches. So this is a problem that we must solve. When we read Shakespeare, we are always given lots of problems, and that is what great art is for, giving us problems that have to be solved and which are not simply solved by the author, but that require our effort and our ideas and thoughts. When Banco sees the witches, he says something very interesting, and at the same time we must remember it because it is one of the themes of this tragedy. He says, who are you? What are you? Because they are not human at first for him. You seem to understand me, by each at once her choppy finger laying upon her skinny lips. You should be women, and yet your birds forbid me to interpret that you are so. Dovreste essere donne, e tuttavia le vostre barbe mi impediscono di credere che siate delle donne. So, Banco, in front of the witches, has doubts about their reality, but also about their sex. And this theme is very important in Macbeth, the tragedy of power, but also the tragedy of the relation between men and women, between a man and his wife, between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Who is the man of the couple? Who is the strong one if we consider the stereotype of the man strong, the woman weak, man strong and cruel, and the woman pitiful, merciful, and mother. Well, who is at the beginning? It is Lady Macbeth, of course, and then it is Macbeth, and then Lady Macbeth again. So it's a reasoning about the relation inside a couple. A married couple or any sort of couple. When Lady Macbeth invokes the spirits of the night, asks them to give her the strength to be cruel and to kill, convince her husband to kill the king, she uses a very, very particular words. I want to read you because, well, and I do suggest you to read this aspect because it's very important. That is, she has just read the letter, and then she says that the raven himself is horse, anche il corvo diventa rauco, that corpse that croaks the fatal entrance of Duncan under my battlements. Come, you spirits, invoca gli spiriti, that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here. Unsex, toglietemi il mio sesso, dissessatemi, toglietemi il mio sesso di donna, and fill me from crown to the toe top full of direst cruelty, riempitemi dalla testa ai piedi, dalla corona ai piedi della più direst cruelty, della più feroce crudeltà. So she asks the spirits of the night to unsex her, to transform her into a man, into something different from what she is. So you will find lots when you read. If you read Macbeth, I do suggest you to do it because it's a great tragedy. Well, you will find lots of references to this sexual uncertainty. And why did I say that it was very important when Macbeth organizes the murder of Banquo by himself? It is important because in that moment he has become totally independent from Lady Macbeth. He calls her Chuck. Chuck means piccolo pulcino, pulcinotta mia. So, to call Chuck such a woman as Lady Macbeth, well, it really means that Macbeth had become independent. Instead, in the opera here, Verdi and Piave decided to change this point. The decision of killing Banquo is taken by Macbeth and Lady Macbeth together. This was probably because Verdi wanted a duet. He needed a male voice and a female voice singing. Okay, there are explanations for this. But from the point of view of the interpretation of the text, well, this is a misunderstanding. And this is something which doesn't really fit with the deepest meanings of the tragedy. Just a few words about Lady Macbeth. In History of Music, she's simply called Lady. They didn't need to add the surname Macbeth because, well, Lady is she. And Verdi wanted to make her a unique character. So Lady enters the stage in the opera reading the letter, not singing. And this is very unusual for a prima donna. In fact, the prima donna of the time, the sopranos of Verdi's time, didn't accept this, and they wanted to enter the stage singing the content of the letter. But Verdi quarreled with them because he wanted them to read, to speak, not to sing. Well, Lady Macbeth, we didn't say much about her, but obviously she's one of the most important characters of the tragedy and of world literature. When at the end of a tragedy, she kills herself. She cannot stand the remorse for this, for her actions and for the situation. There are her famous monologue about the blood on the hands. So I repeat, read the whole tragedy because it's a masterpiece and pay attention to the few suggestions I gave you because they will help you in understanding one of the most beautiful texts that you can find today. Bye bye.